There are civilizations that are born, shine, and fade away in the echo of the history. But there is others that defy time, that refuse to be forgotten. Egypt is one of them. It was not just an empire, was an entire world, a spiritual, political, and artistic universe that left his footprint not only in stone, but in the collective memory of the humanity. Under the scorching sun of the desert, on the shores from the eternal Nile, a civilization arose that loved life, which dialogued with the death, and that turned every daily act into a sacred ritual. This is a journey through more than 3,000 years of history, a story that begins in the fertile clay of the river, crosses pyramids colossal, religious revolutions, conquests, and rebirths. A journey that explores not only kings and battles, but also dreams, fears, and hopes of a people who refused to disappear. This is the history of Egypt, told like never before. A journey in that each stone has a voice, each god has a story, and each pharaoh has a destiny. The sun rose slowly over the vast expanse, golden of the desert, illuminating the calm waters of a river that seemed eternal. There, where life challenged logic and warmth seemed consume everything, sprouted he miracle. The Nile, like a divine artery, gave breath to a people who would learn to love, fear, and venerate each cycle of their channel. In the midst of this hostile environment arose the first villages, made of mud and dreams, where the men they began to understand that they were not alone, that the nature she could be a mother, but also a goddess. The first inhabitants did not build temples, or they wrote books, but yes, they planted wheat, they domesticated animals, and above all, they observed his sky. They looked the stars like someone looking for answers, and learned to read the signs of the river like who listened the voice of the gods. It was just as it was born, the oldest calendar of the world, one that did not only mark the time, but the divine will. The black earth, which they called Kemet, became in a sacred garden where life and death were two sides of a same mirror. There was no kings, neither empires, only scattered communities that were beginning to discover the power of the cooperation. The abundant harvests were not the work of chance, but the fruit of channels built with effort, of dikes that defied chaos. The engineering was born from the need and the religion of the wonder. Every tree, every animal, every star had a spirit, an essence. The gods were not far away. They lived among them, in every corner of the landscape. This is how it was founded, he thought, Egyptian, deeply spiritual, eternally symbolic. The step of the time, he wove networks of exchange between peoples distant. The Mediterranean Sea brought news from other lands, but Egypt looked inwards, towards his sacred river. It was the Nile who united distant villages, who wove invisible links between peoples separated by the geography, but connected by the water. Every year, when the river grew and left behind them a fertile carpet, it was as if the gods they will speak again, and the town listened. That's how it was born, the first social link, the ritual gratitude towards the nature. With time, those villages were transformed in cities, small centers of power where they arose the early leaders. They were not kings still, but wise and protective, men and women who interpreted the signs of the sky, which they organized the jobs collectives, which directed the offerings. The society Egyptian was born without to know it. A hierarchical world, yes, but also deeply communal, where the good common was sacred and the work a way to honor the gods. The first ones, vestiges of art, appear as whispers in the stone, geometric figures, stylized animals, human forms that seem to invoke the invisible. The ceramic becomes in canvas, and the walls of the housing on altars. There is no writing yet, but there is language, a language of symbols, of colors, of proportions. Egypt is gestating its soul, and every daily gesture is already part of a ritual. It is a world in training, a dream that begins to take shape. And yet, this was only the first breath. Because while the mud was dried in the sun, and the children, they ran along the river, something deeper was brewing. A silent promise floated in the air, that of a civilization that would dare to challenge the death, to write his name in the eternity. And what was to come would change the history from the world forever. That force could unite all of these peoples scattered under a single name, a single crown, a single destiny. That you will discover in the next part. The Nile was not just a river. It was a backbone that united distant hearts. In its final stretch, the delta opened its arms like a flower, fertile and generous, where the people who loved trade, fishing, and organization. Further south, where the Nile narrowed between hills and rocks, proud and warlike communities flourished. Although they spoke the same language of the river and worshipped the themselves gods, those two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, looked at each other with distrust. The division was not war, but it was strain contained, and fate seemed to sigh, waiting for the moment to fuse them. That moment arrived with the echo of determined steps and the roar of a will unbreakable. A man emerged of the south, with the fixed gaze and the gods as witnesses. Their name was Narmer, although others they would call Menes. It was a common conqueror. He was visionary, strategist, and symbol. He understood that the strength combined with myth could forge something new, a nation. It was not enough to conquer. It was necessary to convince. It was not enough to govern. Power had to be ritualized. Thus, Narmer undertook his enterprise, to unite the two lands under one crown, and achievement. The legend was carved in stone. The famous Narmer Palette, with its imposing reliefs, features without words what many ages after still go on resounding. The first time that a man was king of all Egypt, his crown combined, he white of the south and the red of the north. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a statement. For the first time in the human history, a town whole, from the Delta to the First Cataract, was recognized under a single authority. The policy had born, and with the concept of state. Narmer not only took cities, took also souls. He founded the city of Memphis in a strategic point between both regions, and from there organized a government that was not based solely on the strength, but also in the spirituality. The pharaoh was not a king like any other. It was the living incarnation of Horus, the god falcon. His body was human, but his essence divine. Thus began a powerful and lasting idea, that ruling Egypt was also keep balance of the universe. And that balance had a sacred name, Maat. With new kingdom emerged institutions. They were organized taxes. Scribes were established. Records were made, harvests. But the most revolutionary thing was the creation of hieroglyphic writing. Each sign was a universe, a connection between the human and the eternal. Writing, it was not just about communicating, it was about immortalizing. Temples began to rise, tombs became more elaborate, and the time acquired other dimension, that of the permanence. The Egyptians, children of the river. Now they knew also children of the time. The pharaoh was not just a man, he was a beginning. His descendants, they inherited not only a throne, but a mission. And from that mission, Egypt began to look at itself same as a chosen people, a civilization blessed by the gods, in charge of maintaining the order of the cosmos. Every ceremony, every edict, every stone laid had a higher purpose. There was something new was born, something immense, a culture that did not distinguish between the sacred and the everyday. But what Narmer forged was not the end, but the beginning of a golden age. From its foundations, others pharaohs would look toward the sky, seeking to touch it. Because what would come next would not be a simple stage. It would be an architectural, spiritual, and symbolic feat that to this day challenges time. The time of the pyramids was about to begin, and with He, the splendor of the gods in earth. Are you ready to ascend with them? The echo of the first pharaohs were not lost in He desert. On the contrary, it multiplied in stone. With the Old Kingdom, Egypt gave a majestic leap toward it impossible. From the year 2686 BC, an era began where the kings not only ruled in life, they wanted transcendent. Don't let them, it was enough to be remembered. They wished to be eternal. And to achieve this, they raised mountains of stone that did not point to the earth, but to heaven. He was born the age of the pyramids, an era where the soul did not die, it only ascended. Was Djoser, also known as Zoser, who changed the rules of the game. With the help from a man whose genius would break centuries of limits, Imhotep created something that had never been seen before. A tomb not like the others, but a structure that rose in layers. The first step pyramid in Saqqara. Already, it was not just about resting in peace, but about symbolically climbing toward the gods. That one construction, it was a revolution, architectural and spiritual. Egypt stopped looking at the river and began to look at infinity. What Djoser started, Cheops took it to the extreme. The vision was not just glorious, it was immense. At Giza, under a darling clean and eternal, he ordered to erect the Great Pyramid. With almost 147 meters high and more than 2 million of blocks, became in the largest architectural work never built by the man in time ancient. Every stone fit with millimeter precision. There was no space for the error, because it wasn't just a tomb, it was a cosmic statement, a message toward the universe. At his side, his descendants Khafra and Menkaura raised their own pyramids, smaller but equally challenging. And among them, a mythological creature emerged, the Sphinx. Lion's body, human face, infinite gaze. Who the sculpted? Why? Still today, his stone eyes. They seem to keep secrets that no one else had deciphered. The Old Kingdom was that, power wrapped in mystery, monuments that spoke in silence, villages, integers mobilized by a sacred vision. But not everything was stone. Behind every block, there was an organization, complex and sophisticated. The pharaoh had his service a body of scribes, architects, engineers, and officials who ensured the good operation of the kingdom. Agriculture flourished, tributes were collected, and thousands of workers, many of them farmers during the floods of the Nile, participated in the constructions. Far from the myths of slavery, the most worked with honor, as an offering to his god-king. At the same time, the religion became richer, more complex. Funerary texts, embalming rituals, and a robust belief system about the afterlife emerged. Death. The soul had to go through tests, trials, and only if it was fair would it reach eternal paradise. That's why the tombs were filled with amulets, provisions, solar boats, and spells. Dying, it wasn't an end, it was a journey. And the pyramids were the doors monumental toward that hereafter. But even the stronger empires have cracks invisible. After centuries of splendor, something began to wobble. The provinces, they were looking for more autonomy. Governors became more powerful. The Nile sometimes did not flood as it had before. The sacred balance, the Maat, was beginning to crack. And so, slowly, the Old Kingdom began to crumble, not because of wars, but because of the weight of its own glow. The age of the pyramids there was reached its summit. What was coming now, it would be a fall, but also the prelude to a renaissance. What occurs when the gods seem to be silent? The story continues. The wind of the desert no longer whispered hymns of glory. The pyramids, still imposing, began to look like ruins of a time far away, although still were standing. What had been an empire as solid as the stone began to crack from within. It was anti-war that brought down the Old Kingdom. It was something more subtle and devastating: the erosion of power, the distrust between regions, and the silent collapse of the sacred order. The Ma'at, divine balance of the universe, was broken, and with he, Egypt entered in a dark and confusing time. The causes were many, and none of them sufficient on its own. The Nile, once predictable as the past of the sun, began to change its rhythms. The harvests became scarcer. Climate change is suspected to have altered the agricultural heart of the country. Hunger brought instability, and the instability, ambition. The nomarchs, governors of provinces, no longer obeyed as before. Instead of representing the pharaoh, they began to act as small kings. Each region became a fiefdom, a political island disconnected from the center. Meanwhile, the figure of the pharaoh, once untouchable and sacred, became distant, weak, sometimes absent. Some kings left hardly any traces. Others, not even were able to control their own temples. The divine aura was fading. The people, needy and confused, no longer looked to the throne with reverence, but with disillusionment. The temples ceased to shine, the tombs became humble, and the rituals funerary, scarce. The splendor had disappeared. There remained he I remember, yes, but also he fear. This period, which modern historians called the First Intermediate Period, was much more than a political crisis. It was a spiritual collapse. Without a pharaoh strong, without a functional administration, the country fragmented, and in that fragmentation arose new forms of power. Heracleopolis, in the north, and Thebes, in the south, began to dispute the fate of the country. There was no longer only one Egypt. There was several, each one claiming the legitimacy of a glory that no longer existed. But not everything was ruin. In half from chaos, the creativity flourished in unexpected ways. Artists began to depict more human, more intimate scenes. Texts written during this period reflect anguish, yes, but also lucidity. The famous Dialogue of a Desperate Man with His Soul is not just literature. It is a testimony of a people who, even in his break, reflected on his meaning of existence. Egypt did not resign itself. He thought to himself, "Same. I was dreaming with becoming again." And that one dream found his seed in the south, in Thebes. There, a new dynasty, still small, began to organize. With discipline, faith, and cunning, they wove a network of alliances, resistances, and plans. They had still the resources, nor prestige. But yes, they had something more powerful: the conviction that Egypt could not die so. One of those leaders, called Mentuhotep II, took the torch of the reunification, and with each battle won, with each restored temple, was turning on again the flame of a nation that had been extinguished. The Old Kingdom had been a masterpiece, its fall a bitter lesson. But from the rubble of the past, something new was beginning to sprout. It wasn't just restoration, it was reinvention, because sometimes only by falling do you learn to be reborn. Who was Mentuhotep? How managed to unite a fragmented country? The Middle Kingdom was about to be born, and with he, a new vision of Egypt. Do you like it? Are you going to lose? Thebes was not just a city, it was a heartbeat, in half. From the silence broken by centuries of fragmentation, it emerged as a living promise, a torch in the darkness. From their still humble temples, the lineage of Theban kings was prepared for something more than reconquering territories. They wanted to restore the soul of Egypt, and it was Mentuhotep II who gave the final step. With military intelligence and religious legitimacy, achieved what seemed impossible: to reunify the two lands. The year was approximately 2055 BC, and Egypt was once again one. But this time, something had changed. Power was not exercised with the mystical haughtiness of the Old Kingdom, but with a more practical, more human outlook. The pharaoh continued being divine, yes, but he was also an administrator, a protector, a strategist. The royal tombs were moved away from the north, and Thebes became a new spiritual center. There, the god Ammon began to rise, and with he, a new one conception of the cosmos and of the government. The balance was re-established, but not since he sky from the land. The administration became more efficient. The taxes were reorganized, and waterworks were expanded. Egypt once again exported grain, papyrus, and flax, and caravans traveled a desert heading to Nubia, the Sinai, and beyond. But more than that, it emerged a thought new, reflective, introspective, almost philosophical. Egyptian literature reached, here is one of its peaks. Texts like the story of Sinuhe or The Eloquent Peasant were not just entertainment. They were windows to a more complex, more moral, more human national consciousness. The town also changed. The notion of justice and eternal life, previously reserved for the powerful, began to become democratized. Burial sites became more diverse, and more Egyptians had access to amulets, sacred texts, and rites of passage. Death continued being a journey, but not just for the kings. Now, any righteous soul could aspire to the eternity. It was the beginning of a silent but profound spiritual revolution that would leave fingerprint in the ages coming. Art too reflected this new sensitivity. The statues showed more real, more serene faces. The reliefs were no longer rigid, but narrative, full of movement. The music, the dance, the poetry flourished in the palaces and also in the common houses. The gardens became spaces for contemplation, and the home, a miniature temple. Middle Kingdom Egypt was not just stronger, it was more self-aware, wiser, more vulnerable. Also, not everything was perfect. The threats were still lurking. The peripheral regions demanded constant attention, and the nobility, now empowered, sometimes challenged the throne. But the state machinery worked, and above all, the spirit Egyptian had recovered his voice. Already it was not an empire in ruins, but a nation that had learned from the pain, who wrote about the soul, who ruled with a clear mind and a firm heart. A nation that, after falling, dared to think about its place in the universe. Thus, the Middle Kingdom was consolidated as a second age golden, not as monumental as the first, but perhaps deeper. Egypt was once again an example for the ancient world. It looked back to the horizon, but what I didn't know was that from beyond of the desert, new winds rose, winds foreigners, and with them, a threat that would change the course of the history Egyptian forever. Who were those mysterious invaders? What brought with them? The arrival of the Hyksos would test everything Egypt believed to be eternal. Don't leave. The best and most dangerous is yet to come. Dusk fell over Middle Kingdom Egypt with a stillness deceptive. Beneath the apparent calm, the world was changing. From the northeast, beyond the sands of the Sinai, strange caravans arrived. Nomadic peoples who did not speak the language of the Nile, who did not worship their gods, and who brought animals with them never seen in He Valley. Horses. They did not arrive as an army in at first. They arrived as traders, as migrants, as foreigners. But little by little, these visitors became invaders. Name would rumble in the history as a wound, the Hyksos. The Egyptians, that they called Hekahasut, the rulers of lands foreigners. They were peoples of Asian origin, probably Semites, with military knowledge very different from that of Egyptians. They used horse-drawn chariots, bronze weapons, and composite bows. In front of them, the traditional Egyptian infantry, it seemed ancient, almost ceremonial. It was a warlike revolution, but more than that, it was a symbolic collapse. For the first time in 4 centuries, Egypt was not a conqueror. It was conquered. The heart of the two lands was shaken. The Hyksos settled with force. They founded its capital in Avaris, in the eastern delta, and from there imposed his dominion over Lower Egypt. They did not destroy local culture. On the contrary, they adopted and adapted. They took names Egyptians, worshipped Seth as their main god, and kept many pharaonic rituals. But the Egyptians did not. They saw themselves as legitimate. They were usurpers, impostors with a crown. The trauma was profound. The fall of the Middle Kingdom wasn't just political. It was a crisis of national identity. Meanwhile, Thebes resisted. In Upper Egypt, a new dynasty of local leaders kept alive the flame of the autonomy. They were not still pharaohs universal, but not either were subjects of Avaris. Among them, brave figures emerged. Sekenenra Ptah, with his skull opened by war, Kamosi, bold and determined, and finally, Ahmosi, who would be the architect of the liberation. The struggle was not only for the territory, it was for the soul of Egypt. And that soul, wounded but not defeated, began to dream with he counterattack. The war against the Hyksos was long, bloody, and fierce. But it was also, was he stage of a lifelong learning. The Egyptians not only endured, they evolved. They learned to use chariots, improved their armament, they reorganized his army. Each defeat became in a lesson, each retreat in a promise. It was not enough by expelling the enemy. It was necessary to rebuild the lost trust, the faith in the own immortality. Egypt could not be just a land of temples. It had to be a land of fire. And the fire arrived. Ahmose-Thermerfur, the young Theban prince, led the final campaign. He fought with intelligence, surrounded Avaris, besieged its walls, and eventually took the city. The Hyksos were expelled. The humiliation washed away with blood, but something had changed forever. Egypt had ceased to be a nation isolated and self-sufficient. Now she knew the outside world, and with that consciousness arose a new Egypt, stronger, more military, more ambitious. What was coming was not a restoration, it was a transformation. The end of the Hyksos did not bring peace, but the impetus of an empire. Egypt would no longer be satisfied with protect its borders. Now he dreamed with expand, with dominate, with rewrite the history with sword and pen. And so is born the new kingdom, the most glorious and expansive era of the ancient Egypt, where pharaohs would become in legend. Are you ready to meet them? What's coming is pure divine fire. The Nile, once again, flowed with pride. The sun rose over Thebes, no longer as a refuge Pertit, but as a triumphant capital. The victory over the Hyksos had not only restored the order, he had lit a flame new, the desire for expansion. Egypt, after centuries of defense, now looked toward outside. It was not enough with protecting its borders. It was time to expand them. Thus began the new kingdom, the most glorious, powerful, and dynamic era of all-time history, Egyptian. And in his heart beat the impulse of an empire. Ahmose-I, the young victor of Avaris, was more than a warrior. He was a builder. He restored temples, reorganized the state, rewarded its generals, and ensured a transition stable. His legacy was not only military, it was institutional. With he was born the 18th dynasty, and with she, a new way of reigning. The pharaohs. They were no longer mere guardians of the cosmic order. Now they were leaders of an empire on the march. Warriors, diplomats, patrons, kings and gods, yes, but also conquerors. Thutmose the was he first in expanding the borders beyond the imaginable. He crossed the Euphrates, subdued Asian kingdoms, brought the Egyptian banner to lands that never had ear to speak of Ra or Amun. It wasn't conquest for conquest's sake. It was prestige, resources, tributes. Each victory brought gold, slaves, cattle, exoticism. Egypt wasn't just feared, it was envied. Its armies, They advanced like a river of spears, and its pharaohs, they were hailed as unconquered sons of the ancient world. But it was his grandson, Thutmose III, who would become true architect of the empire. Educated in the temples, disciplined in the battlefield, combined wisdom and strategy with a thirst for glory that seemed to have no end. He made at least 17 military campaigns, defeated coalitions in Tyre, submitted fortified cities. Their victory in Megiddo became legendary. Neighboring kingdoms not only surrendered, they offered their daughters as wives, their gods as subjects. Egypt became in a sun that does everything illuminated. At home, meanwhile, temples grew like forests of stone. Karnak, especially, became in a monumental sanctuary where the god Amun was worshipped with a devotion that bordered on the absolute. The priests became powerful, rich, influential. The pharaoh, although supreme, began to share the center of power with an increasingly solid religious caste. But for now, the harmony persisted, because everyone, rulers, generals, clerics, and peasants, knew that Egypt was living its highest hour. The arts flourished in imperial proportions. The tombs of the Valley of the Kings began to fill with paintings that narrated mystical journeys through the afterlife, trials of souls, solar boats crossing the sky. Literature exalted the virtues of king. The hymns described battles as divine feats, and the people, although distant from the court, felt involved, because every victory was celebrated, every campaign shared, every tribute invested in splendor. The identity Egyptian was now imperial, but in the height of triumph, too grows the shadow. With so much territory, so many alliances, so much wealth, also they arrived new tensions. In the borders, the enemy always lurked. At home, powers branched out, and in the hearts of some pharaohs were beginning to take shape doubts. Doubts about the gods, about power, about the course. The empire Egyptian there was reached its peak, but even in the summit, some they looked at the sky with questions. What if the gods were not? Who do we believe? The next part will reveal a pharaoh who dared to change everything. Don't miss it, you lose. The history of Egypt seemed unbreakable. The pyramids followed standing, the temples were overflowing incense, and the gods populated every corner of the valley. But then, it appeared a man who dared to question everything. A pharaoh, strange, thin, with a long face and an absent gaze. He was not a warrior, neither a builder in the style of his predecessors. It was something more disturbing, a visionary. His name was Amenhotep IV, but he would soon be changed for another, Akhenaten, the one who serves Aten, the sun, the radiant disk that everything go. From the beginning of his reign, he was out of place with the harmony accustomed. Instead of reinforcing the rituals of Amun, began to marginalize them. He ordered temples to be closed, confiscated the clergy's wealth, and displaced the priests. His vision was absolute. Only Aten deserved worship, a god without human form, without animal face, without mythological lineage, only one circle of light, eternal and indivisible. Akhenaten did not found a new religion. He wanted to cancel all the others. Egypt, land of 1,000 deities, was confronted for the first time with the concept of monotheism. The capital itself was victim of this revolution. The pharaoh, he left Thebes and built a new one from scratch city, Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten, in what is today Amarna. There, in half of the desert, rose palaces, temples and homes in time record. It was a different city, without dark columned halls, without spaces for gods multiple. Everything was bathed in light. Art changed also. The figures became soft, intimate, human. Akhenaten showed himself kissing his wife, playing with his daughters, walking in the sun. It was not a god distant. It was a man. Or so it seemed. Nefertiti, her great royal wife, shone like never before it. There was made a woman in Egypt. His face, immortalized in a bust that still today fascinates the world, seemed to sum up the grace of a fleeting era. Together with Akhenaten, he shared the throne, the rituals, the vision. They were, for an instant, the only mediators between Aten and the men. But the devotion of the people do not continued. Deep rural agricultural Egypt continued to pray in secret to Osiris, to Isis, to Horus. The change was too abrupt, and in the heart of the empire grew bewilderment. Isolation was total. While foreign powers they asked help, Egypt was unresponsive. The army became disorganized. Diplomatic relations cooled. Akhenaten lived obsessed with his god and his city. The rest of the country seemed distant. The governors wrote letters of distress from Canaan and Syria. The imperial machinery was slowly rusting away. Within the palace, including his heirs, died young people. Glory was transformed in golden dust. The sun was shining, but it gave no warmth. When Akhenaten died, it did in the deepest symbolic loneliness, without national mourning, without clear succession, without lasting legacy. His city was abandoned, her name erased, its temples destroyed. The country returned quickly to traditional worship, as if that heresy, it would have been just a bad dream. But the echo of his radical act survived. For the first time, a human being in Egypt had dared to say, "One is the God." And that whisper would mark, centuries after, the history of the world. The one who inherited that world was a child, fragile, sick, confused, and without knowing it, would become in the most famous of all pharaohs. Who was that young king? Why? His grave remained intact? The story now it dives in gold, mystery, and premature death. Do not turn away the eyes. Silence had taken over Akhenaten. After the death of Akhenaten, the sacred city was abandoned like an awkward corpse. The statues were decapitated, the walls erased, the cursed names, and among the rubble of that revolution failed, a fragile, unexpected, tragic figure emerged. A child, barely a teenager, probably of sick blood and a weak body. His name was Tutankhaten, but it would soon change. In a political and symbolic gesture, Tutankhamun, the living man of Amun, the return of the marginalized god. I was only 9 years when was crowned pharaoh, too young to reign, too vulnerable to resist. At his side, powerful guardians took the decisions. His great chamberlain, and Horemheb, the supreme general. They rebuilt traditional temples, restored the influence of the priests of Amun, returned the capital to Thebes. The reign of Child was, in largely, an interlude, but an interlude loaded with symbolism. His figure represented the redemption of an empire wounded by the heresy. The young man Tut lived in the midst of a divided world. He was publicly adored, but privately watched. He married with his average sister, Ankhesenamun, also daughter of Akhenaten. Her marriage was more of a dynastic balancing act than a gesture of love. Together they attempted to give continuity to a royal line that was already faltering. Portraits of the time portray it. They appear delicate, with a serene, almost ethereal face, a royal presence that seemed more like a statue than a man. And, in effect, his life would be short, very short. Died around the 18 years, in circumstances still debated. Accident, congenital disease, palace intrigue. Body was mummified in a hurry, poorly preserved, with signs contradictory. The country, without a clear heir, fell in uncertainty. Took the throne briefly, followed by Horemheb, who I would try to erase all traces of it, child pharaoh and of the Amarnian line. And so, Tutankhamun was forgotten. His name disappeared from the records. His tomb was not looted. His memory faded away. But fate has its ways strangers to revenge from oblivion. More than 3,000 years later, in 1922, a British archaeologist, Howard Carter, under the Lord's patronage Carnarvon, removed the sand of the Valley of the Kings. What he found would change the history of the Egyptology. An intact tomb, closed, sealed with the royal cartridge of a name almost unknown, Tutankhamun. Inside, the time had passed, detained. More than 5,000 objects, alabaster, statuettes, thrones, weapons, chariots, clothing, and a coffin. Inside it, the face golden of a young king I was sleeping in, the eternity. The news shook the world. For the first time, the humanity I could look without mediations within the intimate universe of a pharaoh. It wasn't just archaeology. It was magic. It was poetry. It was the history whispering from the abyss. The face of Tutankhamun, carved into solid gold, it became in a global icon, a symbol of Egypt, of its glory, of its mystery, of his beauty. The forgotten child became immortal, more remembered than the conquering kings, more famous than the prophets. And yet his life was short, his reign weak, his confusing history. Why, then, do we remember it? Perhaps because in he encloses all of Egypt, fragility and splendor, death and resurrection, oblivion and redemption. Tutankhamun was not a great king, but he was the most eternal of all. But after the death of the child Golden, Egypt would seek a strong leader, someone who would reorganize the state, who would impose order, and to prepare the path for the last great pharaohs, who would take now the scepter of destiny. The story go on. The death of Tutankhamun left more than a political vacuum. He left a nation tired of weakness, heresies, and children in the throne. Egypt demanded strength, and the history replied with a new one, dynasty, the 19th. Not born of divine lineages or high nobility, but of military men, men of the battlefield, forged in steel and discipline. The first of them, it was Ramses I, brief in the throne, but decisive. It was like a silent architect, prepared the foundations of a restoration that its son and his grandson would transform in legacy. Ramses I ruled for just over a year, but it wasn't an improvised ruler. He had been commander of the army and high priest of the gods. I knew as it worked the real country, the of the sweat and the sword. In his short reign, reorganized the administration, consolidated internal alliances, and sat his son in the throne without resistance. That son, Seti the Fervor, was who picked up the torch and ran with she toward her renaissance of Egyptian power. It was time for the return of the pharaoh's warriors. Seti, I was a complete sovereign, a relentless warrior, an intelligent reformer, a devoted builder. His military campaigns encompassed Syria, Palestine, Libya, and Nubia. Not only did he reconquer lost territories, reaffirmed the image of the pharaoh like him, arm of the gods. Its walls show epic battles, captured prisoners, chariots in movement. It wasn't just propaganda. It was an affirmation that Egypt was back in charge, and its enemies now had to remember it. The lion woke up again. But Seti was not just a man of war. He was also a great builder. He raised the Temple of Abydos, one of the masterpieces of the Egyptian religious architecture. There is the famous Royal List, a sequence of pharaohs past, carefully carved in stone. With that gesture, Seti wanted to unite past and present, to erase the stains of the heresy, and reconnect with his solar lineage of the ancients. Time, for him, was not just a line. It was a sacred circle, and Egypt had to return to the center of that circle. During his reign, art flourished with an almost purity classical. The sculptures recovered the symmetry, the colors shone again in the reliefs, and royal tombs were carved with a precision that bordered on the celestial. In the Valley of the Kings, the tomb of Seti is one of the deepest and most elaborate ever excavated. It was not a simple dwelling place for the afterlife. It was a spiritual journey, a carved book in rock, where each chamber was a step toward the eternity. But Seti, I was not alone in his project. Since he was young, his son had been at his side, learning every ritual, every maneuver, every gesture of power. That Ramses was young, not yet the great, not yet the god of infinite temples, but now he showed an overflowing energy, an ambition that seemed to overflow the walls of the palace. Egypt, under the shadow of Seti, was preparing for something even grander. The time of the Titans were approaching. Seti I died with honor, leaving his heir a country in order, a loyal army, standing temples, and a name respected. His legacy was firm, dignified, and powerful. But his son would convert the power in legend. Because what was coming now, it was not just history, it was living myth. Who was Ramses Thaqet? Sudu, how reached glory and challenged even the gods? In the next part, we will witness the birth of a pharaoh immortal. Prepare yourself. Colossal. When young Ramses ascended to the throne, Egypt already had been restored by his father. The country was strong, unified, feared. But Ramses did not settle with inherent stability. He wanted something more, immortality. From day one, he saw himself same not only as a king, but as a living monument. Every word, every statue, every temple built was part of a greater work. His name, I had to cross the centuries, and it achieved. Ramses II was not just a pharaoh. It was an era in same. His reign lasted more than 6 decades, 66 years marked by war, construction, diplomacy, and propaganda. From the at first, Ramses presented himself as a born warrior. He led campaigns in Canaan, Syria, and Nubia, showing his power to all neighbors of the empire. The most famous of these campaigns was the Battle of Kadesh, where he faced the Hittites. Although the result was uncertain, Ramses the presented as a total victory. The reliefs in his temples show a glorified epic, him alone, on his chariot, defeating armies integers. But Ramses did not limit himself to the battlefield. He was also a shrewd diplomat. Decades after Kadesh, he signed with the Hittites the first known peace treaty in the history of the humanity, a recorded document in stone, and sealed by both peoples. It wasn't just pragmatism, it was vision. Ramses understood that the eternity, it was not built only with weapons, but also with words. And so wove alliances, married with a foreign princess, and consolidated a lasting balance of power. Its architectural legacy defies all measure. He ordered the construction of the Ramesseum, his funerary temple in Thebes, with giant statues that rivaled with the mountains. But its most impressive jewel, it was Abu Simbel, excavated in the rock of the desert Nubian, where 4 colossi of more than 20 meters show sitting like a god living. The temple is oriented with astronomical precision, so that twice a year, the sun illuminates its face in the interior of the sanctuary. No detail was casual. Each stone I was talking about him also restored ancient temples, rewrote reliefs. He added his royal cartouche on other people's works. For Ramses, the past was a canvas on the which I had to project his shadow. He wanted to be remembered as the greatest of all. Even his performances, they multiplied its figure. In one scene, Ramses could appear 10, 20 times, fighting, praying, triumphing. It was omnipresent, immeasurable, absolute. The people it venerated, the artists idealized, the enemies they feared. And in his court, nobody doubted his divinity. In his personal life was equally prolific. He had at least a dozen wives, including the famous Nefertari, whom dedicated one of the more temples beautiful never built. Their sons and daughters numbered in the dozens, a large family that served as a symbol of abundance and continuity. In the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, many of them were buried with honor. The Ramses dynasty was destined to endure beyond of the body, beyond of the time, but even the colossi are cracked. At the end of his life, Ramses was already an old man with a wrinkled face and a slow gait, but he still reigned. He had buried many of his children. He had seen many generations. When he finally died, the entire country trembled, not only because of the loss of a king, but because Egypt did not know another world that was not his. It had been a constant in the life of his people, and when he left empty, as big as its temples. Ramses became eternal, but the time does not stop, and after his death, the foundations began to crack. Could Egypt survive without your giant? The next one part will reveal it, because after the glory comes the shadow. When the embalmed body of Ramses II was sealed in his grave, not just a man was handed over to the eternity. It was a cycle. It was a world. It was the illusion that Egypt could eternally resist the onslaught of time. For decades, it had been the sun that did not go out, the voice that resonated in temples and battles. But the death does not recognize crowns, and the empire that he raised began, little by little, to unravel. Without wars, without earthquakes, without profanations, only with he past inevitable of the time. His son, Merneptah, took the throne already old man, without he fire that had set fire to his father's reign. He ruled with dignity, but without the spark that moves mountains. The state machinery, so complex as a temple of endless columns, began to creak. External enemies, who for decades had feared Egypt, began to test its edges. In the sea arose wandering, violent, unknown peoples, the towns of the sea. In the Asian borders, the alliances were falling apart. Stability was becoming a mirage. Meanwhile, within the country, power was fragmenting like a statuette. Ancient, the temples accumulated more wealth than the royal palace. The high priests of Amun in Thebes, they spoke with more authority than the pharaohs. The balance between crown and clergy, carefully maintained for generations, was tilted dangerously. The administration was filled with intrigue, with names that lasted only a few years. Many pharaohs did not leave not even a decent grave. They were shadows of what was once a lineage of sons. The economy neither escaped the collapse. The harvests failed more frequently. Nubian gold was not flowing as it had before. Trade was reduced, public works were halted, and the people, the one who had served with devotion under Ramses, began to lose its faith. The royal tombs were looted, some even by those who they should protect them. Corruption woodwormed the moral basis of the state. The eternal dream of the pharaohs were desecrated by desperate hands. And yet, in the midst of this decline, something remained alive. The memory. Art, although poorer, he continued playing scenes of splendor. The reliefs still, they showed the pharaoh defeating enemies. The texts insisted in which the Mat, the sacred order, was preserved. It was like a mirage supported by the memory of what once was. Egypt, like an old man dressed in golden robes, walked with dignity toward the decadence, pretending that everything remained the same. Toward finals of the new kingdom, the kings, they no longer ruled all of Egypt. Upper Egypt was controlled by the priests of Amun. Lower Egypt was becoming increasingly autonomous. The country was fragmented, not officially, but in spirit. The pharaoh was now more symbol than authority. And when the towns from the sea they attacked in mass, nor not even the iron will of Ramses III, one of the last great kings, was able to revert the course of destiny. The 20th dynasty died out amidst conspiracies, palaces, murders, and usurpations. The land of Horus and Osiris remained without legitimate heirs, without unity, without course. But Egypt does not die. It only transforms, because even in his darkest hour, his history continued beating. Something deep, ancient, refused to disappear. Who would take now he control? What forces emerged from chaos? In the next part, a new era begins, not of pharaohs, but of lords of the clergy. The story still has much to reveal. The Nile continued its course, immutable, serene, as if it did not want to look at the disorder that grew on its banks. The stones of the temple still, they sang ancient hymns, but the echoes were lost in hallways empty. Egypt had survived worse storms, but this one, it wasn't an external invasion, nor a devastating war. It was something slower, more painful, the loss of self-same. With the end of the 20th dynasty, began what historians would call the Third Intermediate Period. For the Egyptians, it was simply the time of the tearing. There was no more a single Egypt. In the north, Tanis housed kings who were made called pharaohs, symbolic descendants of Ramses. They ruled the delta. They controlled the routes of the Mediterranean. They tried keep the forms. In the south, however, Thebes had taken another way. There, the high priest of Amun was not just a servant of the temple. He was the authentic ruler. He wore sacred robes, but took political decisions. He administered taxes, organized armies, commanded more than the own King Northern. These priest kings were not crowned with the double crown. They didn't need grandiloquent titles. Their power was rooted in the popular devotion, in the reverential fear that still inspired the god Amun. They ruled with wisdom, yes, but also with calculation. They created lineages within the clergy, where the title of High Priest of Amun was inherited like a throne. Thebes became a theocratic state within a state, and Egypt a puzzle of fragmented identities. In Tanis, the kings of the dynasty Vat'imd tried keep the pharaonic dignity. They buried their dead with pomp. They sponsored public works, restored temples. But something was missing. The aura of divinity, the imperial splendor, the spiritual unity had vanished. The figure of the pharaoh no longer inspired wonder. It was one title among many. Even their tombs, hidden and simple, showed the humility of the new times. Greatness, now, was heritage of the memory. However, Egypt still breathed. Art, although more modest, he continued producing beauty. The schools of scribes persisted. The religious beliefs had not been broken. The people he continued burying his dead with the rituals ancient. The prayers still, they invoked Osiris, Isis, Horus. It was as if culture will cling to itself, resisting disorder from within. A civilization that, although divided on the outside, still I dreamed with his internal unit. The panorama became more complex when dynasties Libyans began to settle in the delta. These towns from the west, who had previously been enemies, now were part of the power. They adopted names Egyptians, learned the rituals, they built temples. But also they brought traditions new, different hierarchies, structures tribal. The emerging Egypt was neither imperial nor pure. It was hybrid, multiple, contradictory, a civilization trying to reconstitute itself, with pieces that no longer fit together altogether. And yet, like a flame that refuses to go out, the spirit Egyptian persisted. The internal struggles, the interferences foreigners, the loss of centrality, everything seemed to announce the end. But the end never came, because Egypt, even broken, remained being Egypt, a country of temples, of symbols, of rites that defied the logic of time. But how much longer could he resist? Could he the faith to keep together what politics divided? In the next part, new forces will arise of the south, a forgotten kingdom, ancient blood, and an unexpected crown. The wind that blew from Nubia did not just bring sand, it brought memory. For centuries, the Egyptians had looked towards the south with a mixture of contempt and need. Nubia was the country of gold, of dark, skinned warriors from temples built in their image of the Nile Valley, but it was also a conquered land, subordinate, distant. Yet while Egypt was dismembered among clerics and petty kings, Nubia remained silent. It watched, it waited, and when arrived the moment, spoke with the voice of a throne. The kingdom of Kush, with its capital in Napata, was not a shadow of Egypt. It was a powerful reflection, a younger and more devout version. Their kings not only adopted Egyptian symbols that they worshipped, they built temples to Amun. They wrote in hieroglyphics. They learned the language of the Nile, but also they kept it yours. A distinct energy, a force almost primitive, a fire old. When the chaos of the Third Intermediate Period reached his spot more fragile, the Kushites, they knew that the moment had arrived, not to invade, but to restore. The first in move was Kashta, which smoothly penetrated to Thebes. He did not need violence, just presence. The clergy of Amun, weakened and nostalgic for firm authority, accepted its power as if responding to a prophecy. Its son, Paye, went further. He crossed the desert with his armies. He defeated the Sirs from the delta, took city after city, and not did with rage, did with devotion. In every temple he entered, he offered incense, made sacrifices, he wrote hymns. He was not a conqueror, he was a redeemer. Hiye proclaimed himself Pharaoh of the Two Lands, founding the 25th dynasty. He was a black man, with broad face, braided beard and deep gaze. His throne was Egyptian, but his spirit permission of the South. He didn't intend to destroy anything. He wanted to heal. His reign, though brief, was like a balm on a torn body, restored the cult, consolidated the administration, respected the ancient ways, and after his descendants would continue his mission. Shabaka, Taharka, Tanutamani, names that for years dominated the throne of the pharaohs. Taharka, in particular, would the most remembered. Under his command, Egypt knew a brief revival. Temples were erected at Karnak, sacred avenues were rebuilt, lost texts were restored. It was a patron, a devotee, a military leader. He fought against Assyrian invaders threatening from the east and defended the border as a lion, but also was victim of the new geopolitical realities. The world was changing. Power was no longer exclusively in the Nile, and the Asian empires became increasingly ambitious. Finally, the Assyrians they advanced with brutality. They sacked Thebes, imposed vassals, and the Black Pharaohs were pushed back into Nubia. They were not defeated. They retreated with dignity. From Napata, they would continue to reign for generations, clinging to their temples and their ancestors. But their passing through Egypt would be forever recorded as an unusual moment. When he south illuminated the north, when the heirs distant, they returned a part of their soul to Egypt. A lot later, historians would try to silence or minimize their legacy. But the temples speak, inscriptions resist, and in the Black Pharaohs still, they walk, proud, between eternal columns. But the winds from the east, there were not yet saying his last word, because after the Kushites would come the Persians, and with they, a new kind of empire. What occurs when Egypt is no longer the center, but just another province? We'll see in the next part. The desert. It was no longer a border. It was a door, open. For centuries, Egypt had resisted waves of invaders, absorbed influences, adapted languages and customs. But something was changing. It was the center of the known world. It was a gem, coveted by empires young, hungry, organized with a different logic. From the heart of Asia, the Persians extended their arms over Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt was the next target. Not as an enemy, but as a trophy. Because dominating Egypt was, in the eyes of the ancient world, to possess the soul of the civilization. The The first conquest arrived with Cambyses II, son of the great Cyrus. In 525 BC, after a swift and decisive campaign, he entered in Egypt and took Memphis. The last indigenous pharaoh, Psamtik III, was defeated. The resistance was minimal. The country was divided, fatigued by internal struggles, without a unifying vision. Cambyses did not destroy temples or burn cities. On the contrary, he adopted the title of pharaoh, offered sacrifices to the gods locals, and presented himself as the legitimate heir of the pharaoh's past. But he was not Egyptian, and all of them they knew. Persian rule was not brutal, but systematic. Egypt was incorporated as a satrapy within the gigantic empire. Achaemenid, foreign administrators imposed new laws, new taxes, new calendars. The temples continued to function, the rituals were not interrupted, but the throne was no longer Egyptian. It was a chair distant, in Susa or Persepolis, where the fate of the Nile was decided. Independence was not abolished with violence. It was dissolved in bureaucracy. The pharaoh was no longer there in the temple, but in another continent. Still thus, the spirit of resistance did not die. Various uprisings marked these decades. Priests, generals, nobles locals, they conspired secretly, waiting for the right moment. Some, they achieved brief restorations of native power, as in the reign of Amyrtius or Nectanebo, who they dreamed would return to Egypt its sovereignty. But the Persians, with his immense army and its spy network, always they returned. Each attempt at release was met with force redoubled. It was a fight of attrition, not of glory. Art and the religion, however, persisted. The temples continued building. In Dendera, Esna, Edfu were carved reliefs with the themselves gods, the same prayers, the themselves hymns of times ancient. The people, although subjugated, kept their cultural memory alive. Religious festivals continued attracting crowds. The agricultural calendar is still ruled everyday life. It was as if, underneath of the yoke foreigner, Egypt will cling to its identity stronger than ever. And although the Persians respected certain aspects of local culture, too imposed its imperial logic. The trade routes were diverted towards Asian interests. Resources flowed toward palaces distant. Egypt was now a periphery. And with each passing year, the generation that remembered the independence was dying. What was left was nostalgia, and a question without answer. Would Egypt return to governing itself? Same ever. But the capricious and cyclical history had a surprise in store. Because from the west, a new wind began to blow. Younger, faster, more relentless, he was Greek. And he brought with him not only an army, but a vision of the world completely different. A vision that would change forever the face of the Nile. Who was that? Young foreigner who would conquer not only Egypt, but half the world. And what would do with the inheritance of the pharaohs? The next part will take us to the encounter between two worlds, the Hellenic and the Egyptian. Don't miss it, you lose. The desert had been crossed many times, but never with such speed. From Macedonia, a young man with a fiery gaze was advancing like a storm. Its name was Alexander. He had defeated the Persians, subdued legendary cities, and brought his army to the ends of the known world. But when arrived in Egypt, he found nothing resistance. They expected it. They wished. Because, after centuries of dominance, foreigner, the town Egyptian looked in, he was not an invader, but a liberator. And he, cunningly, presented himself as such. It was the year 332 BC, when Alexander crossed the Nile. Not it did with arrogance. He visited the temples, he offered incense to the gods, consulted the oracles. He traveled to the Siwa oasis in the heart of the desert, where the oracle of Amun, the same as the pharaohs consulted since ancient times, proclaimed son of the god. It was not a symbolic gesture. Alejandro believed, and Egypt too. So, without a battle, without bloodshed, he was converted. In Pharaoh, a foreigner, yes, but anointed by the themselves gods who ruled for millennia. His stay in Egypt was brief, but profound. He founded a city in the north coast, Alexandria. It was not an impulsive construction, but a vision, designed with ruler and compass, planned as the capital of knowledge, commerce, and power. The port would connect Egypt with the Mediterranean. The avenues would intersect like a network of ideas. The temples and palaces would elevate his name beyond of the time. Alexander did not need pyramids. His legacy would be a living, vibrant city, designed for the eternity. Alexandria grew rapidly, attracting wise men, artists, architects. He was a crossing of worlds, Egyptian, Greek, Eastern. The statues of Isis shared space with those of Athena. The papyri of ancient scribes rested next to Plato's philosophical treatises. The air itself, it seemed, mingled languages. And although Alexander would soon leave for new conquests, Asia, the India, the unattainable horizon, left behind something more than a name. He left a door open between civilizations. When died in Babylon, with only 32 years, his empire was left without clear owner. His generals, the Diadochi, fought over each fragment like jackals around a glorious body. Egypt fell in the hands of one of them, Ptolemy, his childhood companion, his trusted general. He did not proclaim himself king immediately. He waited, he calculated, and when the moment arrived, it was done crowned as pharaoh, starting a new dynasty, the Lagids or Ptolemies, Greeks by blood, but Egyptians by political conviction. The Ptolemies would continue Alexander's legacy with fervor. They did not abolish the traditions Egyptians, they adopted. They were buried as pharaohs. They worshipped the gods' ancients, spoke in hieroglyphics from the walls of temples. But also, they brought your world, the philosophy, theater, rationalism, science. Alexandria became in the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Its libraries housed tens of thousands of texts. Mathematics, medicine, and astronomy were taught in its classrooms. It was a city of light in a world still wrapped in shadows. And yet, this new light did not erase completely the shadows of the past. The peasants of Upper Egypt continued to pray to Amun, to Osiris, as always. The distance between the people and the new sovereigns, although respectful, never closed completely. Egypt was now a crossroads, a territory of translations, but his soul remained being old. I was still waiting for something, or someone, who I would be the last to wear that bicentennial crown. How would end this dynasty Greek woman who dreamed with eternalizing Alexander? In the next part, the eyes of the world will settle on a queen. Her name, Cleopatra. Her destiny would change the history. The waters of the Nile they had seen pass by gods, kings, and conquerors, but never a figure like her. Cleopatra was not born as a myth, but as a woman. Nor was she the most beautiful, nor the strongest. She was, however, the most lucid, the last of a weary dynasty, surrounded by intrigue, wrapped in decadence, but also the only one capable of speaking to the past Egyptian with reverence, and to the Roman world with audacity. He was a descendant of Ptolemy, yes, but he spoke Egyptian, worshipped Isis, and understood the magic of being a symbol. When ascended the throne, Egypt was no longer an empire. It was a bright satellite in a sky dominated by Rome. The country still had temples, libraries, wealth, but his autonomy depended on alliances fragile. Her father, Ptolemy XIII, had bought his throne with gold and humiliation. Cleopatra inherited that scenery with barely 18 years. And since the beginning, he understood that it was not enough to reign. You had to survive the game. It was no longer between gods and men. It was between powers, armies, and diplomacy. In amid family disputes, including a husband-wife who was looking for silence her, Cleopatra. She was banished from Alexandria, but she did not resign herself. From exile, she organized her forces, waited the moment, and found in a ship, Julius Caesar's. The Roman had arrived in Egypt to quell the dynastic conflict. She seduced not with his body, but with his mind. He presented himself wrapped on a carpet, yes, but unfolded much more than sensuality. It displayed intelligence, culture, strategy. Caesar, the recognized as queen and ally. Together, they rebuilt her power. Cleopatra returned to the throne, consolidated his authority, had a son with the most powerful general in the world. It wasn't a love story. It was a state alliance. With Caesar, Egypt regained relevance. Alexandria became a vital hub of Mediterranean trade and politics. But when Caesar was murdered, in Rome, everything trembled. Octavian, and his general, Mark Antony, clashed over the control of the Republic, and Cleopatra, again, chose. This time, on the side of the heart. Mark Antony and Cleopatra. They were more than lovers. They were a political project, united by passion. Yes, but also by a common ideal. They dreamed with an Eastern Empire, with Alexandria as the capital of the world. They had children, carried out campaigns. They proclaimed kings. In Rome, that it was seen as treason. Octavian declared the war, and the Battle of Actium in 31 BC sealed the fate of both. Defeated, they returned to Egypt. Mark Antony took off life, and Cleopatra prepared its end. He didn't commit suicide for love, did it out of dignity, refused to be taken chained to Rome, refusing to see Egypt turned into trophy. In her chambers, surrounded by gold, perfumes, and ancestral symbols, she allowed herself to be bitten, according to the legend, by a cobra, the Uraeus, the same one that adorned the forehead of the pharaohs. Their death was not defeat. It was final act of a civilization that did not want kneel. Cleopatra became in myth, and with she, Egypt closed its last chapter as an independent kingdom. After his death, Egypt was absorbed by Rome. There would be no more pharaohs. There would be no more double crowns, only ruins, memories, and the eternal murmur of the Nile. But in the memory of the world, Cleopatra would remain as something more than a queen, as the last spark of a sacred fire that had burned for 3,000 years. But what was left after? How did Egypt live under Rome? And how did its temples survive? The passage of the centuries? The next part will guide us through the eternal heritage of the country of the pharaohs. Because, although the throne fell, the history was just beginning. The crown had fallen, but the Nile continued flowing. The statues remained standing. The priests still they sang hymns to dawn. Egypt, although converted into province of the vast Roman Empire, did not disappear. It mutated, it retreated in his oldest soul. The year 33 BC marked the beginning of a new era. Roman Egypt. There would no longer be pharaohs, but yes, prefects. There would no longer be sacred thrones, but legions. Rome dominated the territory, but did not yet understand of all that he had conquered. For the Roman emperors, Egypt was more than just a province. It was a symbol. Fertile land, rich in grain, key to the economic stability of the empire, but also a magical, esoteric, wrapped place in an antiquity that overflowed understanding. Augustus, the victor of Cleopatra, did not destroy her temples. On the contrary, protected. He assumed the title of pharaoh before the Egyptian clergy. A diplomatic mask, yes, but also a tacit recognition. Here the rules were different. Here, the time had another rhythm. The temples continued his activity. In Dendera, in Kom Ombo, in Esna, the reliefs followed, carving themselves. The gods were themselves. Horus still raised his spear. Isis still wept for Osiris. Sacred architecture became denser, more symbolic, as if trying to defend itself from the outside world. Hypostyle halls were built as stone forests. The rituals followed, developing according to calendars ancestral. For the town, little had changed. But in the shadows, something was moving. A new air, more subtle than the legions, deeper than the Roman marble. Because with the Romans, too, they arrived new ideas, new religions, new philosophies. Egypt became in a spiritual melting pot. In Alexandria, the jewel of the ancient world, coexisted schools, Greek, Eastern cults, astrology, Chaldea, and the first organized Jewish communities outside Jerusalem. The Library of Alexandria, still alive at this stage, was a temple of learning that challenged the ignorance. In its halls, debates raged about the soul, the universe, and destiny. And within its walls, in silence, a new voice began to whisper, Christianity. The first ones, Christians, Egyptians. They were discreet, but tenacious. They met in houses, in crypts, in forgotten margins. They didn't want temples or statues, just the word. Rome them he chased, but he couldn't extinguish them. The message spread. In just over 3 centuries, would be transformed in the dominant religion. And when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, balance would change. The temples, once the center of the universe, would become strangers. Their gods, silences. The resistance, it was slow but inevitable. In Philae, in Elephantine, still in the 4th century AD, the priests continued turning on the incense as if nothing had changed. The temple of Isis at Philae was the last in close. Until the year 537 AD, more than 500 years after the fall of Cleopatra, they were made over there the ancient rituals. But Rome, already Christianized, already Byzantine, could not allow it. The decree came, and with the definitive silence. The doors were sealed, the statues were covered, and pharaonic Egypt, which had lasted more than 3 millennia, became in memory. But not everything was erased. Columns. They resisted time. The hidden papyri survived in tombs and libraries. The Egyptian language evolved, transforming in Coptic, and in the legends, Isis and Osiris merged with new saints. Egypt did not die, it hid, in the folds of a new faith, of a new language, of a new empire. Like the river that divides to continue flowing, the oldest civilization of the world found another way of existing. But how? Would re-emerge your voice? Who would decipher its mysteries? The Nile waited asleep, until a stone revealed your secret. The next part will be the threshold between oblivion and revelation. For centuries, the ancient Egypt was a wrapped enigma in ruins. The sand-covered temples, the broken obelisks, the hieroglyphics carvings in the walls like echoes of a dead language. Europe, obsessed with Greece and Rome, I saw in Egypt little more than an exotic shadow. A mystery, beautiful, but incomprehensible. Nobody read the signs. Nobody could revive the pharaohs. Tombs were looted, admired reliefs, but their voices, they remained silent. Until one day, by accident, the veil was torn. It was 1799. Napoleon's troops, in his military expedition to Egypt, they excavated in the vicinity of an Ottoman fort in the Rosetta village. Among the rubble, a soldier found a black slab, carved with 3 types of writing: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek ancient. It was a proclamation of the king Ptolemy V, but his importance was going far beyond of the content. That stone, without anyone it knew still, it would be the key to open the door closed for more than 1,000 years, the door of the lost language. Napoleon understood immediately the symbolic value of discovery. He ordered that it be protected, copied, studied. But when France was defeated by the British, the stone passed into English hands as part of the spoils of war. Since then, it would be known as the Rosetta Stone. Brought to the British Museum, it attracted scholars from all over Europe. The best linguists swarmed around its inscriptions, trying to decipher the sacred language of the pharaohs. A centuries-old puzzle was waiting to be resolved. The challenge was immense. Although Greek was understandable, hieroglyphics resisted all known logic. Some believed they were magical symbols. Others were seen as purely decorative images. It was a young French, self-taught and obsessive, who dared to go further. Jean-François Champollion. Since childhood, he had been fascinated with Egypt. He learned Latin, Greek, Coptic. I dreamed read the names of the gods in the stones, and when had in their hands the copies of the stone, did not rest until he understood them. Champollion understood it essential. The hieroglyphics were not just drawings, but a mixture of sounds, ideas, and symbols. Some figures represented syllables, others concepts, others names. In 1822, he managed to decipher the first real name, Rameses. It was like a resurrection. For the first time in more than a millennium, a pharaoh spoke again. The temple walls were no longer silent walls. They were libraries, chronicles, songs, prayers. The past Egyptian, sealed under sacred codes, opened the eyes. Egyptology was born with that act. From there, a new generation of archaeologists, linguists, artists, and adventurers took to the sands of the Nile. They rediscovered tombs, studied mummies, translated papyri. The gods were summoned again. Stories of Horus, Seth, Isis, and Osiris reborn. The royal tombs. They stopped being dark caves to become in narrative scenarios. Each symbol recovered its meaning. Egypt was no longer a stage set. It was once again a living civilization in the memory of the world. The Rosetta Stone was not just a linguistic key. It was a bridge between the present and a past that was thought lost, a crack in the wall of oblivion. Thanks to it, the pharaohs they spoke again, and Egypt, after centuries of silence, recovered his voice. Not as an empire, but as a legacy. Not as a power, but as a soul. But still, there was a revelation missing, something buried beneath layers of time, a grave that, when opened, would change the face of modern Egypt and the history of the archaeology. In the next part, the Sleeping Valley will beat again. For centuries, the Valley of the Kings had been plundered, desecrated, and scavenged. Fed up, it was said that there was nothing left to discover, that all the tombs had been opened, that the secrets were exhausted. But a stubborn Englishman, patient as the Nile itself, he thought it contrary. His name was Howard Carter. And while other archaeologists were looking for easy glory in the great temples, he concentrated in a name almost forgotten, Tutankhamun, a pharaoh young, without recorded feats, almost invisible in the annals of the history. But Carter sensed that his grave was still slept intact. Financing came from the hand of Lord Carnarvon, a noble Briton fascinated by Egypt. Year after year, between sand and frustrations, Carter dug the valley without find what I was looking for. Many it considered a eccentric, a dreamer. But in November 1922, fate brought him gave the reason. A step, barely peeking out from under the rubble, led to a door sealed. In she, a royal cartouche, the name of Tutankhamun. The heart of the archaeologist beat like an ancient drum. There was arrived, when finally broke the inner wall and a lamp peeked out. Carter saw what he described as wonders in everywhere. Ebony and gold statues, ceremonial chariots, beds shaped like sacred animals, carved chests, canopic jars, still perfuming perfumes, dried flowers, arches, jewels, and beyond, a sanctuary, golden. Inside it, a sarcophagus. And inside the sarcophagus, the body of a teenage king. covered with a mask that looked like carved by the gods themselves. The world contained the breathing. Tutankhamun's tomb was not the largest nor the richest, but it was the only one practically intact. Sealed for more than 3,000 years, it contained not only objects, it contained pure time. It was as if pharaonic Egypt would have been encapsulated there, waiting for the right moment to speak. Every object, every inscription, every amulet revealed a part of life, the death and the beliefs of a civilization. It was the largest cultural capsule ever found. And Tutankhamun, forgotten for centuries, became in legend. The discovery caused a worldwide sensation. Newspapers from every continent reported on each discovery. Traveling exhibitions brought the replicas of the treasure for millions. The funeral mask of the pharaoh child turned a global icon. His face serene, with eyes almond-shaped, and a false beard, he became in the image par excellence of the ancient Egypt. It even emerged the legend of a curse, fueled by the sudden death of Lord Carnarvon shortly after of the discovery. Superstition or not, the myth was sealed. But the most important thing was not the gold. It was invisible, the power to reconnect, to bring to the surface the soul of an Egypt that many believed to be buried forever. Thanks to Tutankhamun, the new generations were fascinated with the history, art, religion, and the humanity of the ancient Egyptians. The young man king, who had barely ruled, became an eternal ambassador of his people, an immortal symbol, not for what he did, but for what he stood for. His grave remains being studied until today. The objects still reveal secrets. The analysis of their body showed diseases, deformities, a short and painful life. But none of that overshadows his legacy. Because Tutankhamun taught us that even little can contain the infinite, that even oblivion can be overcome. And if his grave opened the doors of the past, how is it preserved today, that legacy? What makes Egypt, the modern one, with the weight of his eternity? The next part will guide us to the present, where the past still breathing. The sun continues rising on the Nile as it had done for millennia. But now, among the palm trees and sugarcane fields, too there is roads, telephones, mobile phones, and antennas. Egypt is no longer an empire. It's a nation, modern, complex, full of challenges. It continues being Egypt. Each stone of the desert, every fallen column, every painting in a sarcophagus is part of his pulse. Here, the past is not ruin. It is identity. And the history is not locked in museums. Walk through the streets. It mixes with the dust you hear in the prayers. The Egyptians of today, they live between two times. One, fast and frenetic, of cities overcrowded, chaotic markets and changing politics. Another, ancient, invisible, seeping through the cracks of everyday life. In Luxor, in Aswan, in Memphis, the villages rural are built on ancient temples. The children play among fallen columns. The elderly remember legends of pharaohs as if they were forefathers direct. It's not romanticism, it's continuity. Modern Egypt has not forgotten where it came from. Comes, it carry in the fur. During the 20th and 21st centuries, the country undertook a gigantic effort to protect its heritage. Monuments were restored, redesigned museums, were excavated sites still virgins. The transfer of the Temple of Abu Simbel, stone by stone, to save it of the Aswan Dam, was a feat of engineering and cultural love. The creation of the Grand Egyptian Museum, at doors of the pyramids, promises to be a beacon of the archaeological knowledge. It's not just tourism, it's active memory. Bright, the illegal trafficking of antiquities, poverty in regions' rural areas, the lack of historical education in certain sectors threaten that heritage. Political revolutions, religious tensions, economic interests, everything interferes. Egypt struggles every day to balance its present with his eternity. There are those who come the ruins as burdens, others as treasures. Among them emerge the true guardians of the time: archaeologists, restorers, teachers, citizens who understand that preserving is not looking back, it is looking within. Tourism is vital. Millions of people travel each year to see their own eyes what previously only existed in books: the temples of Karnak, the pyramids from Giza, the Valley of the Kings. But that avalanche also requires management. The balance between showing and protecting, between exploiting and conserving, is fragile. Egypt walks a tightrope, trying to prevent its glory from becoming a in-show empty. And yet, despite everything, something remains firm: the emotion. Whoever steps on this land will never forget it. In the faces of the Egyptians of today, there's something ancient about it, not because of their features, but because of their gaze, a mixture of pride and resignation, of roots and resistance. They know their country is unique, that beneath every city there is another, and another, and another, which are heirs of the impossible, and that his mission, although not always its say, is to take care of that fire ancient so that it does not become extinct. Because Egypt is not just the past, it is the present that breathes history. But how does that present connect with the world? What role does Egypt play in the awareness collective global? The next part will explore the impact of this eternal civilization on our arts, our beliefs, and our dreams. Ancient Egypt did not stay in the desert. He crossed oceans, crossed centuries. It sneaked in display cases, libraries, tattoos, comics, video games. It was done image, icon, trend. From the 19th century, when the first travelers, they returned to Europe with tales of obelisks and mummies, until today's digital age, Egypt has fascinated the world like no other civilization. But not only because of its historical achievements. It fascinates because it represents something deeper: the mystery, the eternity, the lost beauty. Egypt is not just history, it's modern myth. After the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the tomb of Tutankhamun, a wave of Egyptomania flooded the West. Paris, London, Vienna, they all wanted a piece of the Nile. They designed buildings with columns, lotiforms, or created furniture inspired by the sarcophagi. Perfumes were sold with names like Isis or Cleopatra. The mummies were on display in private parties. It was an obsession disguised as elegance, and in its center, the idea that ancient Egypt was more than a civilization. It was a gateway toward the sacred. The cinema was not long in coming in to appropriate that door. From the 1930s, with Boris Karloff wrapped in bandages, up to the Colossi Digital of the 21st century, Egypt has been the stage and protagonist. Pyramids, always wrapped in the mist. The pharaohs, among the arrogance and tragedy. Queens, eternal seductresses. Hollywood turned the hieroglyphics in spells, already gods and supervillains. He exaggerated, yes, but also immortalized. Thanks to cinema, millions they met words like Ra, Anubis, Osiris, without need to open a book. Music, too, drank from that symbolic river. On album covers, music videos, lyrics, pop artists, progressive rock bands, electronic musicians, all sought in Egypt an ancient echo for its modern sounds. Fashion made it own. Since the Nefertiti-style fringes and necklaces to prints inspired by reliefs funerary, Egyptian aesthetics became synonymous with mysterious elegance. The black eyeliner, the snake's golden, the bracelet's spiral, signs that crossed time with ease amazing. And in the midst of all this, cultural tourism. Millions of people are attracted not only by the history, but by the excitement of touching it untouchable. From walking where Ramses walked, from looking at the sky where the priests waited the stars. Many they come looking for answers. Others, just photos. But all, without knowing it, they participate in a modern ritual, the of the reunion with it ancient, because Egypt, more than a destination, is a mirror, one that forces us to wonder where we come from, and what we want to remember. Internet, in recent years, it has amplified the Egyptomania, Pharaoh memes, accounts dedicated to reconstructions digital, documentaries in streaming, video games with adventures set among tombs and pyramids. The past is gamified, shared, transformed into experience. And although sometimes it is distorted, it is also democratized. What was previously in the hands of scholars, it is now available to any one child with a cell phone. And with each click, the echo of the ancient Egypt is rewritten once again. But beyond fashion, what remains, what we have really learned from this civilization, millennial? What legacy did it leave us beyond of gold and the stones? In the next part, we will travel to the spiritual heart of the Nile, wisdom that still whispers among the gods. Long before Greece built its schools, long before Rome codified its laws, Egyptians already, they reflected on the death, the justice, the soul, the universe. His legacy is not only in the pyramids or obelisks, it is, above all, in his thought, in their way of looking at the world. Because Egypt didn't just build temples, it built a world view, a philosophy wrapped in myths, in symbols, in rituals, but alive, throbbing, deep. The central principle of that wisdom was Ma'at, the divine order, not just a religious concept, but a moral code, a cosmic compass. Living according to Ma'at was to live in harmony with the universe, with the gods, with the others. It was not to lie, not to steal, not to betray. It was to weigh the heart before the scales of Osiris and wish that it were lighter than a feather. In Egypt, ethics were not abstract. They were concrete. They were inscribed in every act diary. Eating, talking, walking, everything could be sacred if it was done with awareness. The ancient Egyptians, they wrote treatises on the conduct, wisdom texts such as the teachings of Ptahhotep or the Ani's instructions were not children's fables. They were manuals of wisdom civilizing. They taught to listen before speaking, to respect the weak, to not let oneself be carried away by anger, to live with measure, to understand that the true power is in himself, control. Nothing more current, nothing more urgent in our days. Also thought the soul in complex form. It was not a single entity, but many. The Ka, the life force, the Ba, the personality that could fly, the Aj, the luminous part that joined the stars. Every human being was a microcosm. To die, it wasn't about disappearing. It was about transforming. That's why they built tombs like houses. That's why they spoke to the dead. Them they left offerings. Them they asked counsel. In Egypt, the time was not a line. It was a circle, and the existence, an eternal journey. The priests, guardians of knowledge, they did not only perform rituals. They were astronomers, doctors, mathematicians, philosophers. They read the cycles of the sky, treat diseases with plants, calculate distances with millimeter precision. But all that they did it not for science, but for balance. Because knowing the world was to respect it. Because knowing, for them, was also an act of devotion. And that devotion wasn't blind. It was lucid, profound, critical. A mystical thought, yes, but tremendously rational. His vision of the cosmos is also revealing. They did not separate the divine from the natural. Heaven was the body of the goddess Nut, who swallowed the sun at dusk, and it gave birth every morning. The Nile was the tears of Isis. Stars, they were righteous souls sailing in invisible boats. In Egypt, everything had a soul. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was banal. That gaze still challenges us. Today, in an era that often reduces the real to the useful. They knew that essential. It is invisible, but not because that is less true. That wisdom didn't die. It hid. It melted in others' philosophies. It influenced in Greece, in Rome, in the medieval mystics, in the Renaissance alchemists. Today, their echoes resonate in schools of thought, in practices spiritual, in the search contemporary in meaning. Because Egypt not only left us stones, it left us with questions. Questions we're still trying to answer. But how is it preserved today? That spiritual heritage. Where does it still breathe? Intact or transformed? In the next part, we will see how Egyptian myths crossed religions, centuries, and borders invisible. Sometimes, the history does not disappear. It transforms. It changes its skin. Like the sacred serpents of the Nile, ancient Egypt, despite losing its throne, its army, and its language, never lost his soul. That soul slipped, invisible, towards others' territories of the human thought. And while new creeds rose on the ruins of forgotten temples, Egyptian symbols, subtle, discreet, hid between columns, Christian, Islamic verses, esoteric rituals. Egypt was never defeated. It became secret. Religion Christian, born in land Egyptian through Coptic Christianity, inherited more than communities. He inherited imaginary. Isis, the divine mother who breastfeeds the child Horus, was replaced in later icons by Mary with her child Jesus. The iconography was moved with such delicacy that many devotees never do it they knew. The Black Virgins, so venerated in Europe, seem like echoes of the ancient statues of the Great Mother of the South. Egyptian Christianity, persecuted for centuries, kept that connection in churches small. In hymns that still today they retain pharaonic tones. In Islam, which also found a home in the valley of the Nile, the fingerprint Egyptian was not erased, but integrated. Sacred geometries, the symmetrical architecture, writing elevated to art. All of that already existed in the royal tombs and in the temples of Luxor. The deep respect for the word, the rhythm of prayer, the idea of the cosmic unity resonated, although with new names. In Egypt, Islam was not just a religion imposed. It was adapted, dialogued, assimilated by a people who knew convert it unaffiliated in own. But it was in the esoteric currents where Egypt found his most fertile refuge. The medieval alchemists, they venerated it as a cradle of occult knowledge. Hermes Trismegistus, a mythological figure who fused the god Egyptian thought with the Greek Hermes, was considered the father of Hermetic wisdom. From it were derived the secrets of the transmutation, the origins of the tarot, the keys to the universe. The ace above, so below, as above, so below, a Hermetic motto, seemed to have been taken directly from the walls of a temple in Edfu. Even in the Freemasonry, in the occultism of 19th century, in the symbolism of modern novels and films, hieroglyphics, the pyramids, the Eye of Horus and the Ansate Cross, the Ankh, symbol of life, appear as keys to hidden realities. They are used not for fashion, but for their archetypal power. For Egypt understood before anyone else that a symbol is not an image, it is a door. And those who they use it, although they do not know, you are invoking a tradition much older than you imagine. Judaism too touched Heflor Egyptian. The story of the Exodus, central in his spiritual narrative, links the slavery with the freedom, the desert with the revelation. Although while the historical reality of this story is debated, its cultural weight is undeniable. Egypt appears not only as a place of oppression, but as a melting pot, a space where peoples confront each other, mix, transform, where the gods they dialogue, where the soul is put to the test. And yet today, in modern meditations, in alternative therapies, in schools of ancestral wisdom, appear names Egyptians as if they had never left. Osiris, Anubis, Sekhmet, Hathor, they are no longer just gods ancient. They are energies, metaphors, inner mirrors. Spiritual Egypt lives on, not in temples, but in questions, not in dogmas, but in symbols. Because a civilization that thought life as an eternal journey, I knew that death was never the end. But every journey needs to close its circle. In the next and final part, we will bring the threads together: birth, splendor, fall, and renaissance. Because Egypt is not just history, it is a shared destiny. There are civilizations that rise like sand castles, others like mountains, but Egypt was not neither one thing nor the another. It was river. It was a cycle. It was continuous breathing of the time. From the dawn of agriculture to digital libraries, the spirit of the Nile has crossed eras, empires, and borders. It wasn't just a country. It was a way of understanding life, a permanent question thrown into the universe. And that question still resonates. What does it really mean to be eternal? The history of Egypt cannot lock oneself in on dates nor dynasties. It is a symphony of generations who looked to the sky searching for meaning, who turned the death in art and the architecture in prayer. It was a civilization that made of the body a temple, of the language a talisman, an offering of every daily gesture. They were not naive. They were wise men. They understood that power without harmony is ruin, that the knowledge without humility is smoke, that the beauty is not luxury, but balance. From Narmer to Cleopatra, from Imhotep to Champollion, Egypt lived in all its forms: kingdom, empire, province, enigma. It was conquered, sacked, silenced, but never erased, because its power was not in weapons, but in the ideas, in his way of looking at the cosmos and seeing oneself within himself, in his myths, which were maps, in his gods, which were mirrors, in their tombs, which were thresholds. Today, in a fast-paced and fragmented world, Egypt stands as a beacon, not to imitate its monuments, but to remember its message. What's up? Wisdom in the slowness. What's up? Force in silence. That the human and the divine can live together if it is honored mystery. That memory is not nostalgia, it is a compass. And that the soul of a civilization can survive even when his throne no longer exists. In the eyes of those who study hieroglyphics, in the hands of those who they clean a temple with a brush, in the dreams of children playing among ruins, Egypt continues, not as an echo, but as a heartbeat, not as a past, but as a heritage, active. Each generation that remember it is reborn. Every story that names takes it out of the dust. Every symbol that invokes it, turn it on once more. Because Egypt doesn't need to be restored. It needs to be understood, not as an exotic place, but as an essential chapter of the humanity, a mirror in which to recognize ourselves, an abyss in which to ask, a peak from which to look at the horizon. And in that horizon, although the names change and the flags turn, the sun will continue to rise over the Nile, as always it did. And so this journey closes. But Egypt, like the sun it worshipped, has no end, only returns, only resurrections, only eternity. Throughout this journey, we have crossed deserts, climbed pyramids, entered tombs sealed by the time and listened, the voice of a civilization that refused to die. Egypt is not a story of the past. It is a mirror of the present, a living lesson. It speaks to us of the power of the knowledge, of the need for balance, of the search of the human soul to remain, to mean something in a vast and silent universe. And that voice still calls us. From the Karnak stones to hidden manuscripts, from digital libraries to the imagination of the new explorers, Egypt lives on every time someone asks a question, marvels at a symbol, gets excited about a myth, stops before the mystery. So, if this trip moved you, if it aroused your curiosity, If it reminded you of something deep that you didn't know was there in you, don't let it stay here. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring other civilizations, other ancient souls, other stories that, like Egypt, help us understand who we are. Active the notifications so you don't miss each new chapter of the past that we resurrect together. Share this documentary with who also they feel that the history is not a file, but a pulse. And if you want to go further, let in the comments which was the moment that marked you the most, the symbol that still vibrates in your mind, or the question that still you want to explore. This channel is not just a window, it's a bridge, a community of seekers, of passionate people, of restless spirits who know that the knowledge has no age, and that the history is not the past. It is a promise. Thank you for being here, for walking by our side since the first villages from the Nile to the digital sands of the present. This bond that we create through the time is real, and while exist voices that want listen and eyes that want to see, Egypt will continue to speak to us. We will meet again very soon, in other time, in other civilization, in another chapter of the human soul. Until then, may the knowledge guide you, and may the history lives on in you.